Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we are continuing the Friday the 13th series with the 1993 film Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. Here is your trivia question for today. How many characters does Kane Hodder technically play in this film? The answer will be at the end of this video. Our film starts off sometime after the last one, where a young woman is hanging around Crystal Lake when all of a sudden Jason Voorhees shows back up. He begins to chase her out into the middle of the woods, and that's when he realizes he's been set up for a trap. An entire battalion from the FBI begins to take fire upon Jason until he is reduced to just body parts. Those parts are brought back to a lab where a coroner named Phil begins to examine each and every part, including his heart. Seemingly out of nowhere, Phil gets the compulsion to devour Jason's heart. Jason then spends the majority of the rest of the film body hopping to try and find one particular person, anyone that's a Voorhees. It's at this point in the film that we find out that apparently Jason had a sister, and she had a daughter, and her daughter had a child as well. So there's an entire line of Voorhees that he tries to get to, as he can apparently be reconstituted if he takes over one of their bodies. We also meet Stephen Freeman, who happens to be the father of the child and Jessica Kimball's ex. Now, unfortunately, Stephen is the one who keeps getting pointed at as being the actual killer, so he is eventually brought to jail. It's here in jail that he happens to meet a supernatural bounty hunter named Crichton Duke. Now, will Stephen, Crichton, and Jessica be able to work together and stop Jason from reconstituting and regaining his full power? Adam Marcus was the writer and director for this film, and this was his first time doing so. Toby Hooper was considered for the director of this movie. Also, John McTiernan could have directed it, but turned it down so that he could do the movie Last Action Hero. Sean S. Cunningham was one of the producers for this film. He was also the director of the original Friday the 13th. There's also a nice little nod towards him, as the patches on the Crystal Lake police officers say Cunningham County. This movie was filmed in California. They tried to talk Betsy Palmer into reprising her role as Mrs. Voorhees in a couple flashback sequences, but she declined. There is allegedly a comic book out there that bridges the gap between Jason Takes Manhattan and this film, and it shows Jason leaving the toxic waste filled sewers of New York and walking back to Crystal Lake. It also apparently explains why the FBI has a task force for Jason specifically. Now, the original idea was to do a Freddy and Jason film now that New Line Cinema owned the rights to Jason Voorhees, but that ended up staying in developmental hell for quite a while. Now, there is also a reason why this movie is not called Friday the 13th with some number attached to it, and that's due to the fact that Paramount still owned the rights to that name, but New Line could do anything related to Jason Voorhees, the character. Had they been able to actually use the name, the original title they came up with was Friday the 13th, Part 9, The Dark Heart of Jason Voorhees. They also wanted to make Tommy Jarvis the main protagonist for the film, but he was not included in the ownership of what they were able to get. An early concept for the ninth film was called Jason Goes to LA, where there would be two rival gangs fighting, and Jason would show up and start murdering both sides, causing them to have to work together to fight him. Another early concept idea would have treated Jason Takes Manhattan as never having happened, and Jason would have still been in the lake. A mystery man would have dredged the body up and taken it to his lab. The man then would perform an autopsy and remove Jason's heart. The man would consume the heart and gain Jason's powers. The man would then be revealed as Elias Voorhees, Jason's twin brother. John D. LeMay, who played Stephen Freeman in this film, would also appear in the Friday the 13th television series, which has absolutely no connection to the movie series. Carrie Keegan plays Jessica Kimball in this film, but the role almost went to Laurie Holden. Steve Williams would agree to play the character of Crichton Duke, but only if he was able to dress up as a cowboy. Apparently, in the original script, Crichton Duke actually had a much stronger connection to Jason, as at one point he and his girlfriend would have been out on Crystal Lake and Jason would have pulled his girlfriend under and killed her. Duke would survive, and this is also the reason why the line in the film is "Son of a bitch, you remember me?" Tony Todd was also up for the role of Crichton Duke. Richard Grant auditioned for the role of Crichton Duke, but instead ended up with the character of Phil the Coroner. There was originally plans to give Crichton Duke his own spin-off that would have been a prequel, but unfortunately this film was a failure, so that didn't end up happening. This character in the film is called Robert Campbell, and it's actually a tribute to two horror actors, Robert Englund and Bruce Campbell. There are actually quite a few references to horror movies in this film. For instance, there's a Nightmare on Elm Street reference where at the very end of the film, Freddy Krueger's gloved hand comes out and drags Jason's mask down into hell. There's also a reference to the Evil Dead series, as you can clearly see the Necronomicon sitting on a table in the actual Voorhees home. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's a theory that Pamela Voorhees tried to use the Necronomicon to bring Jason back, and it actually did work, but unfortunately, she died before she could find out that it did happen. There's a reference to the film Creepshow, and more specifically the segment called The Crate, as there's actually a crate in the Voorhees basement that is supposed to be the same one from that segment. There's a prop from the film The Birds that actually shows up in this movie. Outside the Voorhees home, there is a jungle gym set that is the same set from the movie The Birds. Jason's prop heart would actually appear in another horror movie a few years later in From Dusk Till Dawn. There's also technically a little bit of a reference to the movie Jaws. At one point in this film, Duke demands $500,000 for the capture of Jason. He says, "For that, you get the mask, the machete, the whole damn thing." And in the original film Jaws, Quint actually has a very similar line when he's demanding $10,000, saying, "For that, you get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing." So the body count for this film is 23, but technically it's 22. You have the assistant coroner who gets stabbed in the head and then gets his face smashed into a grate and turned into hamburger patty. You have both Agent Grieco and Agent Murphy who are killed off screen. Alexis, who gets slashed up by a scalpel. Deborah, who gets impaled with the back of a signpost and then ripped in half. Luke, who is killed off screen. Edna, who gets her head crushed in a car door. Phil, who gets possessed and then eventually melts when his body is no longer needed. Diana, who gets impaled in the back with a knife sharpener. Deputy Josh, who also gets possessed and then melts later when he's no longer needed. Officer Ryan, who gets her head smashed into a locker. Officers Mark and Brian, who get their heads bashed together. Ward, who gets his hand almost completely broken off and then is thrown through a diner door. The random patron at the diner who gets accidentally shot. Shelby, who gets dunked into a deep fryer and then gets burned all over his body. Joey, who gets her entire jaw punched into her face. Vicky, who gets impaled through the stomach with a metal rod. Robert, who gets possessed and assumedly melts off screen. Sheriff Ed Landis, who accidentally gets stabbed out of mistrust and reflexes. Officer Randy, who gets possessed and then apparently his head gets ripped off by the Jason parasite. Crichton Duke gets bear hugged by Jason, which causes his back to be broken. Now, they have actually stated, at least people that worked on the film, that Crichton actually survived this. And finally, Jason Voorhees, who was actually dragged down to hell. So when it comes to the film Jason Goes to Hell the Final Friday, I actually enjoyed this movie. Even though it's very strange and has a very weird plot, I don't know. I just, for some reason, found this one entertaining. So I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, how many characters does Kane Hodder technically play in this film? Technically, Kane Hodder plays 3 characters. He reprises Jason Voorhees for the 3rd time, he plays Agent Gryko, and he's actually the arm for Freddy Krueger that pops out at the end, making him the only actor so far to play both Jason and Freddy, technically. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.